Hello, everyone. Good day, and welcome to today's presentation, An Introduction to Lexile Measures. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today to learn about this topic. My name is Cyan Bastions, and I'm on the Training and Outreach team with ETS. And this presentation is brought to you by ETS and the California Department of Education, or CDE, and Metametrics, the creators of the Lexile framework for reading and the Quantile framework for mathematics. So I'm just going to cover a few housekeeping items before we dive in, and then I'll pass it over to Metametrics. So today's slides, what you're looking at right here, are available on the CAASPP and ELPAC upcoming and on-demand trainings webpage under the Training and Communications tab. And I'm going to pop that right into our chat so everyone can access it. All of the URLs that are mentioned in today's training can be accessed through the resource guide that is also linked there and posted with the PowerPoint. A recording of today's webinar will be available in about 5 to 7 business days usually, and it'll be available on that same webpage, the upcoming and on-demand trainings webpage, as well as on the CAASPP and ELPAC YouTube channel. So again, you can find those materials on the website. Please feel free to disseminate this material or the recording to other administrators or educators who might benefit from this or have an interest in this topic. And lastly, today's chat is going to remain closed. We'll just use it to maybe provide you with some links or some information as needed. But if you have any questions, we do have the Zoom Q&A feature open. So please pop your questions in there and we'll answer your questions as we move along the webinar. And if we have time at the end, we'll be answering your questions then as well. So with that being said, I will pass it over to Mandy from Metametrics to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Cyan, and welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. And again, I do appreciate all of you taking your time out of your day. We want to make this as valuable as possible for you. During this session, like Cyan said, you can feel free to pause me at any time if there's a question. I think it's more important to talk about it when it's relevant to what we're looking at on the screen, but you can also put it into the Q&A and we'll save some time at the end. You'll also have my email information and contact information at the end of this presentation. I do work for Metametrics, but I work closely with ETS and CDE to help with their implementation of the Lexile framework. So if there's anything that you have questions about or we can help you with, you can reach out that way. I guess before we begin, just a little background on myself. So I started out of college as a middle school math teacher, and pretty much that's where I thought I would spend my career. Was hoping to spend my career there and had a unique opportunity to start working in the field of K-12 assessment. And I ended up never leaving that space. And so I really had just a wonderful opportunity to spend the past 25 years working with school districts of all size, large and small, all across the country, and really getting to work with educators, assessment data, practice in the classroom, and really how to bring meaning to that measure. Because a lot of times there's a lot of this data that in the classroom as teachers, we're still looking for ways to really make it actionable. And so that's the goal here today, is to really help you understand the Lexile framework and help give you ways that you can make these measures actionable in day-to-day practice in the classroom. All right, so with that, let's just do a quick overview of some of the things we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with the big picture, really make sure everyone has an understanding of a foundation of what the Lexile framework is, what it measures, because the Lexile framework is unique in that it measures two things at once. It measures the complexity of text materials as well as the comprehension reading ability of a student. And so we'll get more into detail about that and really make sure everyone has a common understanding of the framework. Then we'll really dive into how these Lexile measures can be used. And they can be used at all different levels, from the district to the classroom to even with families at home. Not just for informing classroom instruction, but really matching students with text that's most appropriate for their ability, and also a unique opportunity to really look at longitudinal growth and sort of monitor that growth and progress over time. So we'll talk about that more in depth as we go on. And then finally, we want to talk about and make sure all of you know how to gain access to Metametrics Hub, which is filled with Lexile and Quantile resources and tools that are all free to you. You can access them at any time, and those are the tools that really help you take the measures and make them meaningful in the classroom and or with individual students. So we want to make sure that you know how to get to all of those great resources. Additionally, This session today is actually part of a larger series of presentations that we're hosting with ETS and CDE about Lexile and quantile measures. So while this presentation today is focused on Lexiles, we do have another session coming up on quantile measures. And that session is really focused on understanding the math skills and concepts that students are ready to learn. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, we're going to highlight some of these sessions and the dates and times at the end. So you can write that down and be sure to register. And then archives of past sessions will be included in the upcoming and on-demand training webpage on the CAASPP and ELPAC websites if you need to go there for reference. And I think as Cyan said, we'll also have these recorded, so they'll be posted and made available in a few days as well. All right, so all the housekeeping's out of the way, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's first talk big picture. I think it's important to just kind of level set that these Lexile measures are actually used by over 45 million students, not just across the US, but they're used across the world in various parts. But if we focus even just on the United States, kids in all 50 states are receiving these measures today. And they're receiving these measures in one of two different ways. So the first way is that these measures can be linked to a state accountability assessment. So in this case, with California, we are linked to the California Assessment of Student Performance and Progress, known as CAASPP, for both English language arts and for mathematics. So that means that Lexile measures are reported out right alongside scaled scores in these state summative end-of-year assessments. So that's one way students can receive these measures, or teachers can gain access to them. The other way is that at more the district level or the LEA level, Metametrics partners with a number of different corporate partners that produce curriculum programs, interim assessments, and so we're also linked to those types. So you can have students who are also receiving Lexile measures, possibly multiple times a year through an interim assessment or a curriculum program, in addition to the one linked to the end of the year summative. So because there are a variety of different ways that students can receive these measures and a variety of different benchmark assessments that report, this is kind of goes back to the foundation of the belief at Metametrics. And that belief is that we don't need additional assessments. So a lot of people have sort of a misnotion that there's a Lexile assessment. I'll use air quotes. And there's really no such thing as a Lexile assessment. There's no standalone test that Metametrics produces, because Metametrics doesn't feel that we need any more assessments out there in that space. There's plenty of tests already taking place. What we wanted to do was link the framework to these existing assessments so that as educators and students, you can receive this data without adding any additional testing time. So, and to me, I think after just watching this in the classroom and experiencing it myself for so many years, it's a fantastic way to bring additional measures into the classroom. And so what we want to make sure that you have access to is a list of all of the different assessments and instructional programs that do report out Lexile measures. And so, Cyan, we can either make the link available in the chat, or it will be provided also in your materials at the end of the training. And again, that'll take you to a complete list of all of the assessments and curriculum programs that report Lexile measures. Okay, so as we said before, the CAASPP assessment is linked to the Lexile framework. So there's no additional testing needed to be able to receive these measures. And that is for grades 3 to 8 and grade 11 in California. And so Lexile and quantile measures are reported directly on the student score reports, known as the SSRs, for students who receive scores on that Smarter Balanced ELA and math assessment. And those student score reports do provide a link to the Lexile and Quantile Hub that we'll talk about later. So the nice part is that link is there to give, it could be yourself if you were looking at those reports, or families, access to the hub so that they can have quick access to information about the scores as well as resources. I'm just going to pause here for a moment because we've talked about a lot already, and just make sure if there's any questions, Cyan, you can just let me know.
Yeah, no, we just have a question, just someone asking, interested in learning about the difference between Lexile measures and the scale scores that they're getting from these assessments. But I actually think that we've covered a little bit of that, and it'll start to get more clarity in our next slides as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do also have some additional resources because we get that question often that maybe they're not included in this presentation, but maybe a supplemental that I could provide Cyan that we could include in the resource guide that might be helpful.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Other than that, oh, it does say, we have a question here about why is it that we may get two different Lexile scores reported?
Yeah, so again, very popular question this time of year when students are taking interims and receiving scores, and then also have their end of the year summative. So the best way for me to explain this is that because these scores are linked to a variety of different types of assessments, it's important to keep in mind that those assessments do differ, right? So a traditional summative end of the year assessment typically is much more comprehensive in terms of standards coverage. The test even usually tends to be much longer in length compared to an interim that may only be assessing a subset of standards in a much shorter period of time. And often some of those assessments also have some limits on how high or low students can go or what their item exposure is within those tests. So the makeup of the test itself can be very different. And so the link to those assessments is very different. So what we typically tell educators, not only do you have to take into account the type of assessment, but as we all know, there's always those margins that come into play of error of how was the student feeling that day? Did they have breakfast? Did something happen at home, possibly before they came to school? Were they focused on the test? So there's all these variables that come into play. I wish I had a slide to show you. What I typically say to educators is we want to look for the trend line, right? So we want to look for that path of there may be an outlier in a score, but we want to look at that trend line. And then it's also important to typically emphasize measures that come from a summative assessment a little more heavily than the measures that come from an interim assessment. Again, just because those assessments are typically more comprehensive in standards coverage. So there's actually a wealth of information and training that we provide on this topic, but I think in the time that we have, hopefully that's at least a little bit of guidance. But again, we can provide additional resources after the training if that's helpful. Okay. So I do want to point out that as of the 23-24 school year, the Lexile and quantile measures are now reported for students who take the interim comprehensive assessments or the ICAs as part of the Smarter Balanced Interims for math and ELA. And those measures from the ICAs are available in the California Educator Reporting System that you know as CERS. So these measures are a little more widely accessible now, and we wanted to make sure that we really pointed that out for all of you. This next slide is just showing, I know it's a little bit small and it might be hard to see, but it does show a screenshot of how those measures can be accessed in the system. So in TOMS, from the summative assessment, that's where those measures can be found. And then the Lexile and quantile measures, when you're accessing them in CERS, once those data points, once you're notified that they are available, you typically want to then go in and make sure you look for the it's called select a results view dropdown. And you see from the screenshot, you can typically either select Lexile report, or there would be one for quantile report. And then that would make sure that those measures are included in your report when it's being requested. There's also the ability to have the district and school export files from CERS contain those measures as well. And typically the district test coordinators can assist with that. All right, so just to kind of summarize before we transition, these measures, as we said, are used across the country, and people and teachers and students are using them in a variety of different ways. You know, we're going to talk today about how teachers use these measures to not only differentiate instruction in the classroom, but to really match students with books and texts that are very much at their reading comprehension level. Students can also use these measures to really help connect and monitor and celebrate their own growth. These are data points that students can actually get involved in. And we see, I do work with a couple people that do a lot of training throughout districts in California, and they're always showing me pictures of bulletin boards that teachers have where it's almost like a thermometer and students are monitoring and charting their Lexile or their quantile growth. And it's really exciting to get them involved in that actively themselves, where they're setting goals and they're watching themselves achieve that goal. And not only are they doing that in a single grade level, but then they can start to do that across grade levels and across time to really look at that long-term growth and progress that helps them build their reading comprehension towards college and career readiness. And we'll talk a little bit later, but using it to really gauge their readiness for certain careers that they may be interested in. And then finally, these measures are also incredibly powerful for communicating with families. So being able to use these measures to help communicate if a child's reading on average, on grade level, or helping a family pick out books that might really match their child's ability, and helping them know if those books are available at the library down the street where maybe they could pick them up on the way home. So lots of great ways that these measures can be incorporated at all levels of education. So let's transition now. I want to really go in and talk about the framework a little bit more. And for those that are not familiar with the framework, I think this will give you a really good foundation for where the scores come from. And I think they help to put a little more meaning behind the scores when you see them. So first and foremost, the Lexile framework is a research-based scale, and it measures two things at the same time. You could think about it a lot like a thermometer that's measuring Celsius and Fahrenheit. So the Lexile framework scale is actually measuring, on one hand, the complexity of text and material. And on the other side, through these assessments that we've talked about, it's measuring the reading comprehension ability of students. And so the scale is actually called sort of a conjoined measure, where we can have this common metric that's being used to take student ability and match it with the complexity of text. You can imagine as student ability increases or text complexity increases, those are the numbers you see increasing on the scale. And similarly, as you go down, especially below 0, those values represent our earliest reader text and our earliest reading ability down at that beginning reader level below 0. So I want to set a frame of reference, and this is always a great way to do it, is just to take some texts and kind of walk through them so you can see the level that different texts are analyzed at. You may not be familiar or have read all these texts, but I think we tried to pick some that everybody would be pretty familiar with. So let's begin here below 0 on the Lexile scale. In this space, we don't use negative numbers, and the reason for that is just because it feels very negative to label a student with a measure that has a negative value. So you'll see the letters BR, and BR again stands for beginning reader. So any of these measures with BR are below 0 on the scale. So these are our emergent readers. These are our very earliest decodable texts when you see books that are in this Lexile range. And so for an example, The Very Wet Dog. This book has a BR 180L, and this just means that the majority of the story, if you were to open it, is told with pictures. There's very few sentences. And if they are, sometimes they're incomplete sentences, or you might see something like in the car or in the park. So very low complexity, very simple, short vocabulary. If we start to move up, like the mercury rising a little bit on the thermometer, we come to this next text called Fish Boy. And this measures 160L. So now we're above 0 on the Lexile scale. So this book is actually a story, a little bit more of a story. It is told with sentences, but those sentences are still a mix of complete sentences and fragments. There's still quite a few pictures involved for context, and the sentences tend to be pretty short and declarative. If we continue up the scale, we get to a really familiar text. This one is Charlotte's Web that we're probably all familiar with. And this is coming in at a 680L. So Charlotte's Web starts to move into that chapter book category. So we now see text that's a little bit more complex. It is written in paragraph structure, but it's still written for our young readers. So simpler vocabulary, shorter sentences. I like to pause at this one for a minute, because when we get into books and texts like Harry Potter, which they've been very popular, there's kind of a reason for this. I mean, the content of Harry Potter is interesting to a lot of people, and people just tend to gravitate to books like this. But part of the reason also is that books of this level, this 940L, anything between 800 and 900 tends to be this space on the scale where the majority of texts and novels and books fall. So it tends to be this very comfortable zone of reading for a lot of middle to high school students and adults. And that's why we see a lot of very popular texts falling in this zone. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind when we talk later a little bit about stretching kids for college and career readiness. This can be a zone that is a little tough sometimes to push kids outside of. The next one, and we just have two more so you can kind of see where the top of the scale comes in. The next one is the Scarlet Letter. So this is a much more complex text. It weighs in at 1420 L. It has much more elevated vocabulary, very complex sentence structure. And there's very few pictures, if any, in a book like this. So when these are analyzed, they're coming out much higher. And 1420 tends to be at or even slightly above where we see a lot of college and career materials. So that should just give you a little bit of a comparison there that, you know, some of this is really up at the university level. And finally, this is a university textbook. This is just an example of a biology university book. And in this book, it's very similar. There's very complex vocabulary. There's a lot of words on every page. The paragraph structure is very complex. And there's not a lot of books that sit at this level on the Lexile scale. And you can probably see why most of us probably don't pick up Sustaining Life as a leisurely reading book in the evenings. But we do, Metametrics has found through its research that the majority of college and career entry-level materials tend to fall between that 13 to 14 L. So this just gives you an example that there's certainly text above that, but that 13 to 1400 tends to be that typical zone for college and career readiness. If you're interested in understanding sort of a little bit more about the Lexile map and how all of these books and passages lay out, we do have that map and it is available. There's a link in your resource guide as well. All right. So again, just to kind of go back, it's really important to kind of summarize and draw attention to the fact that there's two kinds of measures that are taking place. The Lexile text measure, the way that Metametrics analyzes that, it is based solely on the complexity of the sentence and the complexity of the vocabulary. So we're talking about the syntax and the semantics of the text being used. And then the reading measure for the student is based on reading comprehension. And some people ask, so I usually like to share it, the expected comprehension at a given level is 75%. So if we know that we're saying, for example, if I go to this slide and we say, this student here is reading at a 770L, we can definitely present her with text at that 70 or a little above or a little below. We're expecting her to very easily be able to comprehend 75% of the material at that 770 level. And that's important to think about because we certainly want to be introducing this child to texts that are even a little more challenging if we want to encourage that independent reading growth. But we also, you know, don't want to just say that these are the only texts that she should be reading are the ones that are at 770. So that's why Metametrics has sort of what they call a zone, or I call it a sweet spot, where we want students to be. And they can be reading, you know, about 100 Lexiles above and 50 below their zone. And that kind of gives them a space where we can feel pretty good about the text and their ability, where they won't get too frustrated, but they also won't be so bored by the text that they'll put it down and not, you know, have a desire to read. So again, these measures are really trying to give guidance, right? They're to sort of give a teacher or give a student or a family guidance as to a range where students should be able to find some texts that are interesting, motivating to them, and can encourage growth without too much frustration. All right. So when we talk about independent reading, you know, this is the way that most kids really become better readers is through independent reading. And, you know, again, with all the research that Metametrics has done, they really emphasize sort of that zone. Now, it's important to always call out that that doesn't mean that just because a book's level doesn't match with a student level, that we should never give that book to the student. I think that's where a lot of our human, you know, interaction and understanding of the student needs to come into play. Because, for example, students, you know, a lot of what students like to read is sometimes based on just pure motivation and interest in their passions. And so, you know, a good example is like a book on dinosaurs. There might be some really complex vocabulary in a book about dinosaurs, but you may have some younger readers that are able to read that simply because they love dinosaurs and they're heavily motivated to figure those words out, or they've had enough exposure and experience that they actually know that difficult vocabulary because they have an interest in that area. So it's just important to keep in mind that this number the Lexile number is not an end-all be-all to the decision of what book students should read. It's really meant to be a guide. So I think it's important to go back to keeping that zone in mind. And then for when we talk about more group instruction, in order for teachers to be able to work with a group of students in the classroom, that's where it's really important to start thinking about instructional scaffolding that might need to take place, any pre-work with vocabulary. And that's where Lexile measures can be so helpful for a group, a small group or a larger group of students. If a teacher can use these measures to have a better gauge and understanding of the Lexile ability of, let's say, the reading group that he or she is about to work with, then they are able to then potentially look at the text that may be used in their lesson. And we'll talk about how they can even hopefully determine what the complexity level of that text is and determine the readiness of those students for that text. I talk with educators a lot when I'm out doing, having these conversations in person. And, teachers love to use the analyzer that we have available in the hub, because they can take some of the material, whether it be a newspaper article or a passage or a short story that maybe they've used in lessons for a long time, but they've never really known the complexity of that text. And so being able to analyze that text and understand the complexity, and then on the flip side, using these measures to understand the comprehension, ability, or readiness of their students helps the teacher to better pair their instruction with what they're about to teach and the materials that they're choosing to use with those particular students. So if a lot of this is sounding familiar, it probably should when we talk about text complexity, because most of these models out there today that talk about text complexity, they really focus in on three specific sort of interconnected elements. And those are really the quantitative measures, the qualitative measures, and then reader and task considerations. And the quantitative measures, those Lexile measures fall into that category, right? Those are measures that are essentially measured by a computer, right? We're either analyzing the text or the students are taking an assessment and there's output on their ability. So Lexile measures tend to fall into that quantitative area. Then we get into qualitative measures, which these include, things like levels of meaning, structure, clarity of language, prior knowledge demands, and those things that really cannot be measured by a computer. And so these are the qualities that really require attentive, like human interaction with students in order to be able to sort of gauge those elements. And then finally, there's all the reader and task considerations that as teachers and education professionals, we know we need to consider when we're trying to match up students with appropriate material. And these things are some of the things we just covered, like what is a student's background knowledge? Do they have background experience or knowledge that's needed to understand a text? Are they motivated about a certain topic or not? I mean, these things all play into that decision-making process about determining text complexity. So we can see here kind of where Lexile falls into this type of model. I'm going to pause actually just for a minute. Cyan, any additional questions at this point before I keep going?
We have a few questions here. One question that we have is, how can I equate a grade level to a Lexile score? And they're also mentioning that grade levels tend to have a range, and sometimes a score may live across two grade levels.
That's true. So whoever asked the question is probably referring to looking at the grade level charts that are in the hub, which are very helpful because they do provide sort of a range of Lexile measures per grade level. What I always stress is important to remember about those ranges is that those are not cut scores, right? Those are not based on students in just the state of California. Those are national norms that are in the hub that give a picture or a representation of how students across the entire United States, from the sampling of millions of students that were used for that norm, how they are typically scoring in each grade level. So they're great for reference, just for that as a norm reference. It is just important to keep in mind, though, that those are national. And that's also the reason why you see that overlap. So, cut scores would typically come from something like a summative assessment, where the state was involved in having a decision process that said, this is exactly where we need our California third graders to be at. But these norms they're not cut scores. They're just reference points to allow teachers, educators, families, students to have perspective on where sort of the average third grader nationwide is scoring in a Lexile range. And so sometimes those overlaps can be hard if someone is trying to use them a little more precisely than as a reference. But I would always just caution that that's what they're for. They're meant to be a reference point, and used in collaboration with other data or other observations from teachers.
Great, thank you, Mandy. We also have a question here asking about how the range of the Lexile range corresponds to CAASPP scaled scores by grade level. So is there a direct way that those correspond?
So there's not really a quick descriptive answer I can give other than to say that whether it's the CAASPP assessment or any other assessment that the Lexile framework is linked to, there is an original psychometrically, there's a psychometric linking process that is used. And I mean, I could go really in depth in terms of like how they do that linking study, but I think there's a lot more. There's not really like a straightforward answer. What happens is out of that linking study comes a conversion table. And the conversion table provides a conversion from a CAASPP scaled score to a Lexile measure. And so that is what is used to be able to provide the scores. Now, those conversion tables are not public because they're behind the scenes with the assessment vendors. That's how they report the scores. And that is all part of the research that's done between the state partner and Metametrics.
We also have another question here. It says, what about including the discussion of graphic novel selections to students? They are crucial sometimes to bridging and helping dyslexic students, ADD students, etc., and reluctant readers. So they're noting that graphic novel scores are much different. And do you provide a grade level reference for graphic novels as well?
So when we're saying graphic novels, just like heavily text supported or image supported.
That's my understanding of what
image supported. Yeah. Well, I think, that's a perfect question actually for the slide here that we're on, because the next thing I was going to talk about is limitations, right? That the way that the text analyzer works to produce the complexity measure is based on those two things we just talked about earlier, right? Text complexity, sentence structure, vocabulary complexity. It's not based on the things you see on the screen. So the analyzer does not take age appropriateness of content into account. It also doesn't take, I thought this was actually on this slide, but I'm looking and I don't think it is, but it doesn't take picture support into account. And as we all know, pictures do often really help readers support text that they can't fully comprehend and help them draw conclusions about what that text might be about. So the analyzer does not take into account pictures that may or may not be present on a page. So it's purely just analyzing the text without that. So it certainly is, if there is text or specialized text that has a lot of additional visual supports, I mean, essentially that, to me, that does seem like that could have the potential to lower the complexity just because you have that added support. But just please keep in mind that the level that might be on a book like that is purely just based on the text portion.
Great. And kind of possibly in line with this, someone was asking if you have any guidance about assessing Lexile levels for students with extensive support needs.
Not at this moment that we have a slide prepared. So being able to adjust, I guess, is what the question is, like knowing they take an assessment. I think it'd be important to understand the type of accommodations that may have been present on the assessment that they took that produced the score. I think those are great questions. It's just something that we probably have to ask some more follow-up questions on to be able to give the right information. So maybe we could follow up on that one later afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just one more question, and then I think we can wrap up the other questions after the next slides. But going back to talking about the Lexile scores being norm referenced, someone is asking, because we're looking at the average for these scores, are the grade level ranges possibly going to change slightly from year to year?
So that the grade level ranges, I'm assuming they're asking, that are in those grade level charts in the hub.
That's my understanding as well.
Okay, so they only change when the norms are redone, and we actually are entering into a new norming period where in the next year, the plan is to release new norms. So they don't change yearly because there's quite a process, as you can imagine, of going out and collecting this data and analyzing it. And then, as we all know, we went through this period of COVID where it didn't really feel appropriate to be analyzing norm data that so heavily occurred during COVID, when that may or may not be what we want to consider normal or typical performance for students. So we really needed to get outside that window a little bit. But we are now at a place where we fully are planning to have some updated norms in the next year. So just keep that in mind. I think the date in the hub is always up there. There's a little description at the top that talks about when the norms are from, but they definitely do not change every single year. In most instances, it's typical in most assessments or places to only change the norms about every 5 to 7 years.
And actually, Mandy, I do have one more question that I wanted to run by you here.
Mm-hmm.
But someone is asking about how Lexile scores compared to other balanced literacy programs like Accelerated Reader. They're also referencing the programs DRA and LLI. So they're just wondering how these measures compare and how teachers might use these levels in a way that is different from those other programs.
So I'm not as probably intimately familiar with those programs to be able to kind of talk about a one-to-one comparison. My understanding is there is some sort of like rating or level on those programs. So just from some of the conversations that I've had with teachers and talking about this, the Lexile measures, the feedback that I hear both from inside Metametrics and from educators is that the Lexile measures tend to be more discrete and a little more descriptive. So sometimes when you have other programs that do give levels, there's nothing wrong with those levels, but you may have 2 texts in those programs that you would see. The example they've given me is like there's 2 texts and they have the same measure in another program. But with Lexiles, because we have that beginning reader designation, especially at that lower level, we have much more ability to sort of go down to a more granular level. And so often you could take 2 texts that would have had the same measure, and now the Lexile is able to separate that measure a little bit to give a little bit more insight into the exact complexity of those texts. So my feeling is they probably complement each other because you may be able to get an additional level of information from the Lexile that isn't available on the measures that are being used by some of those other programs.
Great. Yeah, I think we can pause here and just continue with the slides, and we can circle back to questions in a bit.
Sounds good. All right, so we've talked a little bit about limitations. We've talked about a lot of this, I think, background knowledge, motivation, those are things, but it's always important for me to call out text quality too, right? We're not measuring the quality of text, right? That's something that's judgment based. So just keeping those things in mind. All right, and so before we move into talking about the hub a little bit, just in summary, these values, the Lexile values and measures really help to target instruction to students, whether that's individual students, through tutoring, through one-on-one work, or with small groups or large classroom groups of students, where these measures can be used to help sort of gauge the ability level of the students that someone's working with, and then be able to match instruction to those students. They're also incredibly helpful for monitoring growth and progress. So we talked a little bit about how these measures are consistent over time. They're consistent across grade levels as students move through grades. These aren't just a measure that a student can chart with in one grade level and then it kind of disappears in the next. So there's that. And then Metametrics has done a really large body of research by looking at thousands of materials that are entry-level materials for a lot of the bright outlook careers, not just in California, but in all 50 states. And they've also looked at a lot of college entry-level materials. So we're talking about books, textbooks when it comes to college materials. When it comes to careers, we're talking about entry-level exams, manuals, different materials that people need to read as they enter jobs. And these materials were analyzed, and Metametrics has a career database that essentially allows educators and students and counselors to better understand what the Lexile measure is that is the target Lexile to have the reading comprehension ability that a student needs to have to be ready to basically enter college or to enter one of those selected careers. And so there's all of this other potential with these measures to be able to use them to help kids gain the motivation to work towards being ready for careers or college or the workforce. And then finally, just the communication piece. with families, and just being able to communicate student achievement, whether that be by using grade level charts, as many of you have asked about, to just be able to share the progress or share the current ability level of where a child is at, or to be able to, share the hub and help parents find resources to help students that may be struggling, or just help continue their growth and learning of reading at home. All right. So at this point, what we want to do, we've covered all the, foundational details of the framework, and probably maybe more information than some of you wanted to have, but we're going to talk a little bit about the hub and make sure you know how to access the hub and what types of tools and resources you have the ability to use at your fingertips for free. So these tools in the hub are provided to all educators across California at no cost, and that is purely because Metametrics has this partnership with California. And so this is part of our partnership, that we want to ensure that you have access to all of these resources. The hub can be accessed by going to the link you see here on my screen, which is hub.lexile.com. But it also can be accessed from there's a link in TOMS. So that's just another place where educators can be able to get into the hub. So I also really want to pause here and just draw your attention to the fact that a brand new version of this hub is actually about to launch in November. So the things we talk about today, I'd encourage you to go out, log in, register for the hub, gain access, start trying to use some of these tools. But in November, when the new version releases, things may look a little different. Most of the things that are in there will still be there in November. They're just going to look and feel a little different because we're improving and enhancing a lot of the accessibility of these tools. And sometimes we have to change the way they look and feel to meet accessibility requirements. So just keep in mind that if you go in one day and you go in another day and they look different, it's just because we have a new release headed our way in November. I will also point out that one of the exciting changes is this hub will now be optimized for use on a tablet or a phone, as well as a computer. And that's a huge improvement to be able to access this from anywhere that you need. All right, so let's talk for a minute about some of the tools and resources that are available. On the tool side, you will find things like Find a Book and Find a Decodable Book. Now, these are two of probably our Metametrics most popular tools on the reading side. And these basically help an educator or a student or a family go in, and you can either enter a Lexile measure and be able to find books of interest. You can put in categories or topics that interest a student and find books that are at their level and match their interest. You can also search out a particular book in general, or if you happen to not know a student's Lexile measure, and sometimes this is the case with a parent, you can even just say that my child's a 5th grader and there's a checkbox for my student finds reading challenging, and it will automatically choose the correct Lexile zone. It's a broader zone, but it will find a zone that you could find text in. So these tools are highly valuable. They also link the user right out to a library where you can find the book, or Amazon, or even really inexpensive websites like ABE Books, where you can often purchase used books for just a couple of dollars. So this is one of our most widely used tools. Find a Decodable Book works very similarly. It is focused on the decodables at the earlier foundational reading level. We also have Text Analyzer. This is a tool that educators have a limited number of uses a month. I should know the number off the top of my head. I think it's something like 20, where educators can copy and paste, drop text into a window, and have an analyzation done of the text. Now, this is not an official certified Lexile measure. A lot of companies partner with Metametrics and they send in their material, and we do a full analyzation of the material and certify those measures. These are meant to be measure estimates. They're meant to be used in the classroom with families, so teachers can help gauge materials to match with students. So again, that analyzer is in the hub and available. And like I said, it does have a limited number of times you can use it per month, but there's an ample amount. The Growth Planner is a way to help look at Lexile measures across time and look at trajectory for a student and be able to help do some growth planning and monitoring. And that Growth Planner connects nicely with the career database, so that could be a classroom teacher sits down with a student or a counselor to be able to pull up some careers of interest and be able to see what the Lexile measure or expected demand is for that career, and help set some goals with that student. Again, the career database does have a limited number of uses per month. I think it's going up right now in the new version, I think to 30, which I think is fantastic because it's kind of fun once you get in there to keep looking at careers, but that's a good one to keep in mind. And then on the resource side, in our resource center, that's where you'll find decodable passages. And I do want to mention that these tend to be very widely used. These are a newer resource for Metametrics in the last couple of years. Metametrics partnered with decodable authors to create over 100, I think there's over 100 passages to date in there. And these passages are very short. They contain 2 comprehension questions and 1 small illustration, and they can be accessed immediately. They're organized by vowel sound, like short A, short O, so that instructors of early literacy can go in and have immediate access to resources. This has been a really great one because with all the letters training and professional development that's going on across the country to support literacy, the challenge after trainings like that sometimes is getting your hands on free, easy to access resources. And so these decodable passages have been really fantastic and well received because they are free and available for you today to use. In addition to that, on the resource side, we have word lists. These word lists are actually generated from some really interesting research that Metametrics has done around vocabulary. So most of the vocabulary lists that are out there today were not based on the K-12 education space. They were based on adult text, and they really didn't accurately represent the vocabulary that's important for students in K-12 at the various grade levels to be learning. And so these word lists cover a variety of subject areas, including math, English, social studies, and science. And they're available at all the grade levels and then at the high school level. They're grouped 9 to 12. So what these do is really provide not only the key vocabulary that was present across curriculum, across the United States, looking at only K-12 materials, it also provides the frequency, which that's really the key part. So you get to see these vocabulary lists organized and labeled by the frequency of how often these terms occur in the curriculum for these grade levels. And so they're great reference materials for teachers teaching curriculum to see if these words show up in some of the lessons that you teach. And should they be there? Should they be words that maybe you emphasize a little bit more or a little bit less based on some of this research and information that's available? So those have also been a really helpful reference. I've had a lot of educator feedback on those lately and how different teachers are incorporating those. And then finally, grade level charts. It sounds like most of you are super familiar with these. These are based on the norm data that we talked about. They're available for Lexile and Quantile, all grade levels, K to 12, and they do provide that reference point, and they're printable, so they're great for parent conferences as well. And then the final tool is called Measures Manager. Sometimes people like to use this to reconcile when there are multiple measures that students are receiving from a variety of different assessments, which was in line with the question that someone asked at the beginning of the presentation. So this Measures Manager, you can input the measures, you can select the different assessments that those measures were from, and the system understands, which were interim, which were summative, and helps to reconcile a measure for a teacher or student to use. So that's a lot of description. Hopefully you'll join us for some of our deep dive sessions where we'll actually go in and demonstrate some of these tools, but it's just, I wanted to make sure we at least covered a high level description of these so you have an understanding of what is available in the hub today and in November. All right, so let me just leave you with key takeaways for today. I want to make sure that when you leave here today that you really feel confident in understanding that Lexile measures can help gauge the degree of challenge between students and their ability to read and the difficulty of the material that's being presented to them, as well as the fact that you have free access, I can't stress that enough, to tons and tools of resources to help you utilize these measures with students, with families, and in the classroom. And all you need to do is just go in and ensure that you use your district provided email. That is key when you register for the hub if you're doing it for the first time, and it will recognize you as a California educator. Please do not use personal like Apple emails or Gmails because those will not be recognized and you wouldn't get the same level of access to these tools and resources. Third, that these measures really are important in helping to take a longitudinal view of student growth and progress and being able to help motivate students and work towards college and career readiness. And then finally, they really help everyone, whether it be a student going home, talking to their families about their progress, or parents coming in for a parent meeting with a teacher, but they really help to create more effective communication and kind of bridge that gap between home and school. And so with that, Cyan, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you just to kind of cover what our next sessions are that are coming up in the series.
Yeah, absolutely. Mandy has alluded to this already, but we have multiple sessions in this series. Tomorrow we're holding a similar session today, but our focus will be on quantile measures, so an introduction to quantile measures tomorrow from 3 to 4 p.m. as well. And then next week, we will have a deep dive into the tools. And so we'll demonstrate some of the tools on the hub, and that will be on October 2nd and October 3rd next week. And those, I believe, are also from 3 to 4 p.m. Let me see. And then the next slide, we have a recording. We're recording today's session, and it'll probably take about 5 to 7 business days, but it'll be up on the upcoming and on-demands trainings page that I linked. I'll pop the link back into the chat as well. And then we'll get to some questions here in our last 10 minutes, but wanted to pop this QR code and we'll just leave this up while we answer questions. But we really, would love to get your feedback. Getting feedback on these exit surveys really helps us improve our training. So you can scan this QR code here, or I'm also just posted the link into the chat. So this survey actually is for today and tomorrow's session. If you plan to attend both, then you're welcome to either submit this twice or to wait until after tomorrow's session to provide your feedback. If you plan to just only attend today for Lexile information, then yeah, we highly encourage you to fill out the survey. It really helps us make sure we're providing good quality content to you. But with that, we can keep that survey QR code up and we can start looking at the questions and move over to that. I know there was a couple questions I wanted to bring up first. Give me one moment to refine this. Oh, someone asked that you were able to look up the 50th percentile Lexile score and the 90th percentile Lexile score for each grade level. And so someone is asking how that can be best used by educators or explained to parents.
So yes, the grade level charts typically present, I think it's like at the 20th percentile, 50th, 75th, and 90th. Don't quote me, but it's somewhere along that range of the bell curve. And you currently in today's hub, I think you can even adjust and decide which percentile you want to focus on. In the new version, we're going to kind of guide everyone to the middle a little bit more because that's really where the majority of students at that grade level then are scoring. So that's what we always typically advise, right? Like when you're looking at these with grade level charts, we say, keep in mind that the spring end of year are typically where you want to focus when you're talking with parents, because again, that's after a full year worth of learning and coverage of standards. So those measures are then those norms are reflective of sort of that whole year of learning opportunity. So keep that in mind. And then we always would steer you towards sort of the center of that bell curve. In terms of the percentiles that you're looking between. I mean, there's no right or wrong. They're all in there for you to look at as you wish. But what I think is sometimes helpful for a teacher is, you can look at those higher or lower ends of the bell curve if you're trying to get a better understanding of sort of the outliers where your more advanced students may be scoring, where your students that are struggling a little bit more may be scoring. That's where those lower and higher percentiles can be helpful, but typically keeping focus on the middle percentiles.
Thank you, Mandy. And then we actually have a couple people asking about families accessing the Lexile Quantile Hub. And can we just clarify how it works for the educators with their district email, and then for families and what tools are available to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for bringing that up. So families can also register for the hub. When they go to the landing page, there are a couple of icons that they can click on when you're registering. So all of you would click on the educator icon, right? We want you to choose educator, put in your educator email, gives you full access. Parents would click on the parent icon. And it may say family icon in the future. They're talking about that name, but there'll be an icon for parents or families. And what that does is it still grants them access, and they can actually use any personal email that they have, because they will not gain premium access to the hub. What they typically gain access to is the Find a Book tool. They gain access to some grade level charts so that they can look and make norm references. They can find books for their students. And I'm trying to just stick just to the Lexile side. I think those are the two main areas that parents can access, because they are the two most common tools for parents to use. So they just need to focus on their personal email and registering as a family or parent.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else is asking, in terms of tool recommendations, what do you think are the best tools to monitor students' progress and let's see, sorry here, to monitor student progress and when they want to improve their Lexile scores?
Best tools to use.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the growth monitoring tool, it can be a helpful visualization, because it kind of gives you a projection of where the student's been scoring and what the trajectory is. So sometimes that's nice motivation for a student to say, well, I want to change that trajectory, right? I want to really help, make that curve go a little higher. And so some of those things are just nice to be able to look out and see those projections. I also think the career database, like I think back to when I was teaching and I had those couple students who just never did their homework, didn't understand the value of what they were learning, didn't ever think they were going to use it. And so why put effort into it? And I think back now that if I could have sat down with them, really talked to them about something they were interested in, let's say one of them really wanted to be a mechanic, we could have pulled up mechanic in the career database, and we could have really looked to see what Lexile measure and quantile measure should you strive for. It's not an absolute if you're not there, but what should you strive for to be at the readiness level to enter that career? And I think that would have really driven and increased motivation with students who just needed something extra. And so I love that tool personally, just in terms of like really trying to find students the motivation to want to improve. But hands down, Metametrics would always tell you that the most reading growth happens through independent reading. So we want kids to be constantly independent reading, and they're only going to do that if we can provide them with suggestions for books that are not going to bore them and not going to frustrate them. And so that's where that Lexile zone comes in, and that's where Find a Book comes in, is to really help pair them with text that can just keep them engaged in reading. And ultimately, that's going to be the key in driving their scores higher.
Great. We have another question here asking whether the Lexile level for each CAASPP test matches to the grade level.
If each Lexile level for each CAASPP test is matched to the grade level. I don't know if I'm tracking with the question exactly, because Lexile levels are not grade specific, right? So I just want to make sure those grade level charts are just references in terms of where kids tend to score, but there's not a set Lexile level or cut score for every grade. They are, they're linked based on the difficulty of the items that are in the CAASPP that are presented at those grade levels. So, there's a lot of psychometric work that goes on behind the scenes to understand what type of items are presented to ELA items are presented in the CAASPP, let's say to students at grade 4. And then without getting into detail, when items are embedded into those tests to do the link, we're trying to look at that same level of difficulty to make that connection. So that goes into the linking process. But I think if I'm understanding the question, I think the main point I'd want to clarify is that there's not necessarily Lexile levels per grade.
Yeah, that was my understanding too. I wasn't entirely sure what this person's question was, if we addressed it here. If we didn't, in your resource guide, I linked, you can find that on the upcoming and on-demand trainings page. You'll find contact information. If you wanted to clarify your question, or if you had further questions, you can always reach out. I know we're coming up on our last minute here. And so if you have any questions that crop up after today, or that weren't addressed, you can reach out to the contact information there. You can also reach out to, I believe it's still in your resource guide, but there's the email address caloutreach@ets.org. I can throw that in the chat. We're coming up are at time now, so I just want to throw it back to you, Mandy, if you want to wrap up here. If there was anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's it. I thank everybody for your time today. I know it's hard at the end of the day to sometimes join and pay attention to a training, but hopefully you're taking away some good information. And I would encourage you, as Cyan said, to look at the follow-up resources. There'll be a lot of links and information that can provide more detailed content on some of the things we've talked about today. And I think that's it. So have a great day, and thank you everybody for joining.